I grew up in a narrow gray house on Willow Harbor Road in Cleveland, America, a house that looked bigger from the outside than it ever felt on the inside. People in the neighborhood thought our family was close, maybe even happy, because my father always waved politely when he cut the grass, and my mother smiled like a woman who had it all. But the truth was, inside that house, I was more of a shadow than a daughter. My parents, Mark and Susan, treated me like I was made of air. They fed me, clothed me, and let me live under their roof, but they never once tried to know me. I learned early that silence was my safest choice. Most days, I stayed in my small bedroom with pale yellow walls that were peeling at the corners. The carpet had a dark stain near the door from when I spilled paint as a child. I remember crying that day, thinking my parents would be angry, but they didn't even look long enough to notice it. That was how my entire childhood felt. They never looked long enough to notice me. My only real family connection was my grandfather, William Harrison, my father's father, who lived in a grand stone house in Denver, America. His house sat on a hill overlooking long green fields and had tall white pillars across the porch. He always told me that a house should feel warm the moment you step inside, not cold and judging like the one I grew up in. Whenever my parents visited him, they acted sweet and polite, but their smiles were made of plastic. I could always tell my grandfather knew the truth. He would sit with me in his office, surrounded by old books and maps from Europe, and say, "You're going to grow into someone strong, no matter what anyone tells you." He was the only person who ever said that. By the time I turned 18, I left home with a suitcase full of thrift store clothes and $120 I had saved from part-time jobs. My parents didn't cry. They didn't hug me. They simply nodded like they were approving a business decision, not watching their daughter walk out into the world. I moved to Charlotte and rented a small 2-bedroom apartment for $900 a month. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine. I painted the walls soft blue, bought secondhand furniture, and worked at a local accounting office where I handled bookkeeping for small businesses. My life was simple, but peaceful. For the first time, I didn't feel like I had to shrink myself to fit inside someone else's expectations. I still visited my grandfather twice a year, and each time he hugged me, as I mattered more to him than the whole world. He would hand me envelopes with small amounts, sometimes $200, sometimes $500, and tell me to use it for something that would make my life easier. I never asked for it, but he always insisted. Everything changed on a cold morning in January. I was sitting at my tiny dining table, drinking a cup of coffee with a chipped rim, when my phone rang. It was a lawyer from Denver. His voice was gentle but heavy. "I'm sorry, Miss Harrison," he said. "Your grandfather passed away last night." The mug slipped from my hand and shattered on the floor. I didn't even notice the coffee spreading across the tiles. My chest felt tight, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. My grandfather was the only person who ever saw me. The only person who cared enough to ask how I was doing, not because it was polite, but because he genuinely wanted to know. I flew to Denver the next day. His stone house felt different without him inside. The porch lights were on, but the warmth was gone. His study still smelled like old books and cedarwood, and I stood there with my hands shaking, wishing he would walk through the door one more time. The lawyer, Mr. Bennett, met me there and explained the details of the will. When he said my name, I stopped listening to everything else. The words felt unreal. Your grandfather left everything to you. Everything. His $3 million house in Denver. His land in Colorado Springs is valued at nearly $400,000. His savings totaled $8 million. His bonds and investment accounts are worth almost $4 million more. I stared at the papers, unable to speak. It felt like the room was spinning. I knew he loved me, but I had never imagined this. Mr. Bennett explained that my grandfather had written the will long ago, after seeing how my parents treated me. He had told him that I was the only one who had ever shown him real affection, not because he had money, but because he was my grandfather. 2 days later, before I even had time to process anything, my parents appeared at the Denver house. Not to comfort me, not to grieve. They came for the money. My mother didn't even greet me. She walked straight into the living room and said, "We need to discuss the inheritance. Your grandfather would have wanted the family to decide together." My father nodded sharply. Everything he owned should be divided fairly. You know that. Fairly. That was the word they chose after ignoring me for nearly 3 decades. When I refused, they stormed out angrily. The next morning, I received court papers at the house. They were suing me for the entire estate. It felt like the final proof that I had never truly been their daughter. But something else was waiting for them in that courtroom, something they were not prepared for at all. And neither was I. The morning of the hearing felt colder than it should have been for Charlotte. I stood on the courthouse steps with my hands tucked tightly into the pockets of my coat, the wind brushing against my face in sharp little bites. I had barely slept the night before. The thought of facing the 2 people who had ignored me my whole life and were now trying to steal everything my grandfather left me made my chest feel heavy. My lawyer, Emily Brooks, met me at the entrance wearing a dark navy suit and a calm expression that made me wish I could borrow her courage for the day. She touched my arm softly and said, "You're not alone today. Not anymore." But it didn't feel that way yet. Inside the courthouse, everything echoed. Footsteps, doors closing, paper shuffling. I took my seat at our small wooden table and tried to steady my breathing. I could feel my heart pounding loudly, and for a moment, I worried everyone could hear it. The smell of old files and polished wood filled the room, the same smell I remembered from sitting in school offices as a child when teachers tried to convince my parents to attend meetings. They never did. Then the door at the back opened and my parents walked in. My mother had her chin lifted high, her heels clicking sharply against the floor, as though she were arriving at a dinner party instead of a lawsuit. She didn't look at me with warmth, not even fake warmth. Instead, she scanned me up and down and rolled her eyes, just like she used to when I asked for help with homework or tried to show her an art project. My father stood beside her with that same tight smirk he always wore whenever he thought he had control over a situation. He had his expensive gray suit on, probably bought just yesterday to look like a serious victim. There was no sign of my brother, Eric, but I didn't expect him. He'd never shown up when it mattered. They sat down with their attorney, a tall man named Lawson Reed, who charged thousands of dollars just to breathe. He looked at me with a polite smile, but I could tell he had already judged me, just a quiet girl who'd be easy to tear apart. My parents whispered to each other, glancing at me with smug expressions, as if the outcome had already been decided. My stomach twisted. This courtroom was supposed to protect the truth, but all I could think about was how many times the truth had never protected me before. A moment later, the room grew still. The judge's door opened, and a tall man with silver hair and stern eyes walked in. His black robe flowed behind him as he approached the bench. His face looked familiar, though I couldn't place it at first. His nameplate read, Judge Thomas Walker. Something inside me tugged at the back of my mind. He began flipping through the files, the ones with my name, my full name, printed in bold across the top. My hands trembled slightly. He read silently for a moment, then stopped. He lifted his eyes and looked directly at me. The color drained from his face, and his eyes widened just a little. Then he spoke. "Hold on," he said, his voice dropping. "These cases are against you?" Everything stopped. Even the air. My parents shifted uncomfortably. Their attorney looked confused. Emily straightened in her chair, sensing something I didn't. "Yes, Your Honor," Lawson said proudly. "This young woman wrongfully." But the judge cut him off. He didn't even look at him. He kept staring at me as if seeing a ghost from his past. Then he said the words that shattered the entire courtroom. "I know this young woman." My mother's head snapped toward me. My father muttered under his breath, "What?" Judge Walker leaned forward slightly. "She is engaged to my son, Michael." My parents went silent. Their faces drained of color so quickly it almost made me dizzy. My heart, meanwhile, skipped so many beats I thought it might stop. Yes, I had been dating Michael quietly for 8 months, ever since he walked into the accounting office where I worked to ask for help with the business audit. But I had no idea his father was the judge. And I certainly had no idea his father knew me. The judge continued, his tone becoming sharper, heavier. "I have known her grandfather, William Harrison, for 40 years. He was my closest friend. I was present when he prepared his will. I witnessed him sign it, and I know without question that he gave his entire estate to her. No one else. He said the words with a firmness that filled the room. My parents' lawyer tried to interrupt again, but the judge shut him down instantly. You will not argue with me on a matter I was legally involved in. Emily sat quietly beside me, her eyes burning with pride. I felt my own heartbeat settle for the first time since the hearing began. A warmth spread through my chest, not because of the money, but because someone was finally standing up for me. Someone who knew the truth. Meanwhile, my parents sat frozen. My mother's eyes darted between me and the judge, confusion, anger, and fear mixing across her face. My father kept blinking as if trying to wake up from a bad dream. For the first time in my life, I watched the two people who always made me feel small suddenly look tiny themselves. As the judge organized the next steps of the case, I sat there breathing steadily, a quiet strength growing inside me. I wasn't the invisible daughter anymore. In that courtroom, for the first time, I was seen, and everything that happened next would change the balance of power forever. The investigation began faster than anyone expected. Judge Walker ordered it the same afternoon, his voice steady and sharp, leaving no space for argument. My parents had walked into that courtroom believing they were about to humiliate me, ruin me, and take every dollar my grandfather trusted me with. They had no idea the truth was about to swallow them whole. A team of financial investigators reviewed every detail connected to the case: statements, emails, phone records, bank transfers, and the forged documents my parents had tried so hard to hide. For 2 weeks, I waited in Charlotte at my apartment, sitting every night at my small kitchen table, wondering how everything in my life had collapsed and shifted so quickly. Some nights, I cried for my grandfather. Other nights, I cried for the childhood I should have had. But I never cried for my parents. Not once. Emily called me one morning with a voice so crisp it almost sounded like triumph. "It's worse than we thought," she said. "They didn't just file a false claim. They planned the entire scheme before your grandfather even passed." Those words sank into me as stones dropped into water. The report showed that my parents had contacted 2 real estate agents in Denver weeks before my grandfather died, asking for estimates on selling the house. They had looked into transferring some of his accounts into my father's name. They even tried to convince a bank employee to give them access to a safety deposit box they claimed belonged to the family. It didn't. It was mine. My parents had always treated me like I was slow or simple, but the truth was, they assumed I would never fight back. They never expected anyone to stand behind me. They never imagined someone like Judge Walker, someone powerful, respected, and deeply loyal to my grandfather, would step in. The courtroom was full for the final hearing. The benches behind me were lined with other people waiting for their cases, but I felt like the entire world had narrowed into one long wooden aisle leading to the judge's bench. My parents walked in quietly this time, without their usual confidence. My mother stared straight ahead, avoiding my eyes, while my father looked like he had aged 10 years in 2 weeks. Judge Walker entered, and silence swept across the room like a cold wind. He took a seat, adjusted his glasses, and lifted the investigation file. The sound of papers shifting echoed through the air. "This case," he began, "is much bigger than a family disagreement." My mother flinched. "This case shows deliberate fraud, manipulation, and attempted theft of an estate valued at over $12 million. The evidence is overwhelming." My father's shoulders slumped forward. He didn't even try to pretend anymore. Judge Walker continued, "Your daughter inherited this estate legally. You filed false claims, forged documents, and attempted to coerce financial institutions into illegal transfers. That ends today." My parents' attorney stood to speak, but the judge raised his hand. "Sit down. There is nothing you can say that will change the facts." The room grew painfully still. I could feel my heartbeat pressing against my ribs. Then the judge said words I will never forget. "You attempted to steal from your own child." His voice carried a weight that felt like justice itself. He set the papers down, folded his hands, and delivered the final ruling. "You will pay a penalty of $180,000 for damages, legal fees, and intentional fraud. Furthermore, This case will be recorded as a serious offense, and the estate remains fully and permanently in the possession of your daughter." My mother gasped loudly, holding the edge of the table as if she might fall. My father opened his mouth, but no sound came out. His face turned red, then pale, then red again. For the first time in my entire life, I saw fear flicker across his eyes. It didn't bring me joy, but it did bring me peace. When the judge dismissed the court, people started whispering. Some stared at my parents with open shock. Others looked at me with quiet sympathy. Emily placed a hand on my arm and whispered, "It's over. You won." As we stepped into the hallway, my parents followed behind me. The moment the doors closed, my mother reached for my wrist with trembling fingers. "Honey, listen, we didn't know," she whispered. "We didn't mean it. We were just confused." Her voice quivered with desperation, something I had never heard from her before. She sounded like a woman who had lost everything, not just money, but control. I looked at her hand, touching me. A hand that had never held mine when I cried. A hand that had pushed me aside in every way a parent can push a child aside. Gently, I pulled my arm away. "You meant every part of it," I said softly. My father stepped forward, opening his mouth to speak, but I didn't let him. "You didn't see me for 28 years, I said. "Don't pretend to see me now." They just stood there. Two people who once believed they were bigger than the world, now reduced to something small, something powerless, something broken by their own choices. For the first time, they felt what I had felt for years. Invisible. I turned away from them and walked toward the courthouse doors, the sunlight spilling in through the glass panes. Emily walked beside me, but I barely heard her speaking. My mind was filled with the one truth that had finally sunk in. When a family decides you are nothing, the greatest revenge is becoming someone without them. And I had. After the final ruling, I stayed in Charlotte for one more week, mostly to gather my thoughts and pack my things. My small two-bedroom apartment had been my safe place for years, the first home I ever built for myself without fear or judgment. Every corner carried pieces of me. The chip dining table I bought for $20 at a yard sale, the second-hand bookshelf filled with accounting manuals and old romance novels, the soft blue walls that I painted myself while listening to music at midnight. Leaving it felt a little like closing a chapter of my life I had fought hard to create. But there was a bigger life waiting for me now, one my grandfather had planned long before I understood what he saw in me. I drove to Denver with everything I owned packed in 2 suitcases and a trunk of boxes. When I reached my grandfather's stone house on the hill, the sun was setting behind the wide fields, painting the sky with soft orange and pink shades. The tall white pillars glowed in the fading light, and for the first time since his funeral, I felt something warm inside me. Not the kind of warmth you feel from people, but the kind that comes from being somewhere you are meant to be. When I stepped inside, the air smelled faintly of cedar wood, just like it always did. His office was exactly as he left it, books stacked everywhere, his worn leather chair sitting quietly behind the desk, and the painting of the European mountains hanging above the fireplace. I sat down in his chair, tracing my fingers along the carved wooden edges, and whispered, "I'm here, Grandpa. I made it." For the next month, I turned that house into a home again. I hired a local team and spent almost $20,000 fixing the roof, polishing the floors, and restoring the garden outside. I kept all the old books, repainted the walls a warm cream, and added soft rugs to the hallways. Every night, I walked through each room, letting the memories settle around me. I didn't feel lonely, not in the way I had felt in my parents' house. Here, the silence felt like peace, not punishment. Michael visited often during the renovation. He brought boxes of tea, flower pots, picture frames, and blankets he knew I would like. He never tried to take over the house or make decisions for me. He simply asked, "What do you want this room to feel like?" No one had ever asked me that about anything before. Sometimes I caught him standing in the doorway of my grandfather's study, his hands in his pockets, studying the shelves. One evening, he said, "My father and your grandfather used to sit right here every summer, talking about life, money, mistakes, and second chances. He never stopped believing in you." I didn't know my grandfather had spoken about me that way, but hearing it brought tears to my eyes. As the weeks went by, my parents tried to reach me. They sent letters at first, long, emotional ones filled with excuses, half-truths, and forced apologies. They said they were lost, confused, stressed, and overwhelmed. They blamed grief, miscommunication, and even the lawyer they had hired. They never blamed themselves. When the letters didn't work, they called from different numbers. Then they drove to the house one afternoon, parking outside the gate like strangers who had lost their way. My mother stepped out first, her hair pulled back, her expression a mixture of fear and hope. My father stood behind her, his arms crossed, but his posture slouched. They looked smaller somehow, not just physically but as people. They rang the bell and waited. I watched them through the window for a long moment, my heart steady, my breath calm. Then I turned away. Some doors are meant to stay closed. I didn't owe them anything, not forgiveness, not conversation, not another chance to break me. Ending contact wasn't out of anger. It was out of self-respect. Healing sometimes means leaving people exactly where they left you. I focused on building my new life instead. I joined a community group in Denver, met neighbors who welcomed me with genuine smiles, and found a small charity my grandfather used to support. I donated $5,000 in his name and volunteered twice a week. Working with them made me feel closer to him, as if I were continuing something he started. Then one clear evening, just as the sky turned purple, Michael asked me to join him on the back patio. The hills stretched behind us, glowing softly as the sun dipped low. He stood there holding a small velvet box, his face gentle and steady. "I know what you've been through," he said softly. "I know how much you've carried alone. But I also know who you've become. You're stronger than anyone I've ever known. And I want to spend my life beside you, not because of the estate, not because of money, but because of who you are." He opened the box. Inside was a simple diamond ring, elegant and bright. "Will you marry me?" he asked. My breath caught, not from surprise but from something deeper, relief. Relief that I had finally reached a place where love meant safety, not sacrifice. Relief that I could choose my future without fear. I said yes. We held each other as the wind brushed through the tall grass, and for the first time in my life, I felt completely, unquestionably seen. Now, when I sit in the study with the fireplace warm against my back, I think about the girl I used to be. The girl who lived in a house full of cold glances and quiet disappointment. And then I think about the woman I became. A woman who inherited more than money. A woman who inherited courage, freedom, and the strength to walk forward without the people who tried to keep her small. I built a new life not just because I inherited a fortune, but because I finally inherited myself.